Hi guys, this is Mr. Herbst here, and today's focus is going to be on the structure of a flower. Now here I have a pomegranate. This is a really good fruit. If you haven't ever had one of these, you're missing out. Anyway, believe it or not, this fruit right here at one time was part of a flower. If you don't believe me, by the end of this PowerPoint you will. So we have several parts to every flower. One of those parts is called the sepal. That is the outermost part of the flower. That's this arrow's pointing to it right here. They're not always green, but they're similar to like the leaves, so the outer part of the flower. Every flower has one of these, but sometimes you can't see them. The goal of the sepal is to protect the flower from insect damage as well as dehydration. So we want to keep that water inside of the flower as much as possible. Next we have the petals. When we think of flowers, we typically think of the petals. That's the most common thing that we refer to as flowers. They're very brightly colored. Their purpose is to attract things to them. Have you ever really seen a flower that looked bad? I mean, they don't really exist very much. There's a couple of flowers that actually are black and look real nasty, but for the most part, flowers are very colorful. They attract, the colors attract us. We are drawn to the colors, we're drawn to the scent. So petals, they have a lot, they often give off perfume as well. They're really brightly colored to attract animals to them. The goal is to have those animals pollinate. And another goal is to have a surface for insects to rest on while they want to feed. So the insects will have a little nice place to rest on while they get that nectar out of the flower. Our next part of the flower is called the stamen. And the stamen is composed of two different parts. We have the anther, which is here at the top. It's like a little ball that sits on a filament. That's this region right here. And the anther, it produces pollen. Pollen is the sperm of a plant. It is the male portion of the plant. So stamens are the male portion of the plant. One thing I haven't mentioned really yet is that to every flower we have both a male and a female portion. The male portion is called the stamen. And so the stamen is composed of the upper part, which is called the anther, which produces the pollen, as well as the lower part, which is like a stick that hosts that anther up on a stick. Our next part is called the pistil. That is the female portion of the plant. Of the flower. And that actually is composed of three parts. It's a little bit more complicated than the male parts, but it has a stigma. That's this upper region right here. That's a really sticky part of the flower. Actually, if you've ever touched a flower and you've been like, ooh, that's kind of sticky, that's probably because you touched the stamen or stigma. The stigma, pollen will land on it. The reason it's so sticky is to attract as much pollen as possible. And after that, the pollen will travel down through the style into the ovary. So we have three parts to the pistil. We have the stigma, we have the style, and we have the ovary. The style is like the long tube that pollen will pass through, and then the ovary, that is actually the portion that will contain all the eggs, and eventually those eggs can become seeds. So if you've ever eaten a pomegranate before, you know that inside there's a bunch of seeds. Those are called arils, actually, and each one of those seeds has the capability of producing a whole other pomegranate tree. But this right here, the whole thing that contains all of the seeds, it's called an ovary. So this region right here is the ovary of the plant. This right here is the ovary. You can even see that right here there is an area where on my pomegranate it used to be attached to the tree. I even have a little bit of wood left on this right here. But up here, actually, you can see it. There's actually some parts to the flower. You can see that inside of there's these little dried out stringy things. Those are all the stamens, and underneath of that was probably the stigma. And right here is, I know it doesn't really look very nice to look at anymore, but all of this right here was at one time the petals of this flower. So this is a plant ovary. Look how big it is. The next thing I want to talk about is this concept called pollination. pollination can occur in basically one of three ways. We can either have wind, which will scatter the pollen randomly, and so the pollen will go from the stamen, the male part of the plant, to the stigma, either randomly. This wind will blow it around, and it will land on the stigma. Or we can have insects, such as this bee right here, or this ant, which will actually they'll run around on the petals of the flower, and pollen will stick to them, and then they'll rub up against another flower, and they'll pollinate another flower that way. Now, also another thing which is really interesting about flowers is that they actually have the ability to pollinate themselves. That's really kind of weird to think about. If we have both a male and a female part to every flower, that kind of means that a flower can actually have sex with itself. That's a little bit weird to think about, but actually that's one of the three ways that plants can pollinate. We have two types of flowers. We actually can have a complete flower, which will have all four of the organs. It will have the sepals, the petals, stamens, and the pistils. Or we can have an incomplete flower. These are not as common as a complete flower, but are still common that we do find in nature. And an incomplete flower is something that will lack one or more of the parts of the flower, one or more of the four parts. This right here, take a look at this flower right here. I'll give you a second. Let me know if this is a complete flower or an incomplete flower. But hopefully you knew that this was actually an incomplete flower. We don't have those anthers. Normally an anther would stick up like this, and like this, and like this. So normally we would have the stamen, which has the little anther on it, sticking up, and as well as the stigma. That would be this sticky region right here. So this flower right here does not actually have any of those stamens right there. So this is an incomplete flower. So here's a question to think about. How are different flower types important to the way that the plant survives? Well, the flower is shaped to promote different types of pollination methods. So this guy right here, he's like a tube shape. Think about this. Like whatever is pollinating this has to go all the way deep down into the bottom of that tube in order to pollinate it. Well, what's going to do that? Probably this hummingbird right here. The beak of the hummingbird, this little beak right here, is really long and has the ability to go deep down into the tube shape of the flower. So that's probably how this flower likes to be pollinated. So those are our cross-pollinators, the ones that rely on wind or insects to pollinate them, as well as certain types of animals. These guys here will probably have a stamen that's shorter than the pistil. So right here, this cool-looking thing right there, that is the pistil of the flower. And then these things right here, these fluffy looking things, those are the stamens. And so if you think about it, since we have the stigma is taller than the stamens, how could this flower pollinate itself? Probably not very easily. The pollen would have to go up over and hit the stigma. So this probably doesn't pollinate itself. Probably this flower right here relies on animals or the wind in order to blow that pollen all around, and it will hopefully land on the stigma, eventually fertilizing the ovary down here. We can also have self-pollinators. These will often want to pollinate themselves, but they have the ability to actually still have insects pollinate them. So in this case, when we have self-pollinators, the stamens will usually be longer than the pistil. So if you look here, we have the stamens right here that I'm circling, and here we have the pistil right here. It appears that the stamen is actually a little bit longer than the pistil, and that happens because this flower right here does not mind to pollinate itself. But here's the problem. Think about this. If it's pollinating itself, the genes from itself are going to itself, right? It's never actually sharing genes with another plant. What's the problem with that? Well, think about me. Let's say that I have the ability to reproduce myself. Let's say that I have a flaw. If I have a flaw and I reproduce myself, every single one of the people that I reproduce from myself is going to have that same flaw. I have gray hair. So every time that I reproduce, if I reproduce myself, I'm going to have gray hair. Every single time. And that could be bad, right? That's why flowers typically want to be pollinated by other pollinators so they can share their genes, and hopefully that things like gray hair or bad things like certain cancers that could run within the plant don't actually aren't distributed across all the other generations. So that concludes the structures of the flowers. My next video is going to be on flower function. So stay tuned, folks. You all have a nice day.